at the Fresh Streams conference, and really looking forward to the seminar that we're going to have together, exploring this issue of how do you lead in the middle of a crisis. The last year has been dramatic, hasn't it, in terms of how it's impacted our ability to lead and the environment in which we are leading. We've all been through the experience of responding to a global pandemic, to an emergency. At times it's felt like we've been on an emergency response team responding to a major crisis in our community, where we've seen the need to run around and to help rescue people in the midst of a global crisis. Just thinking back to April and the first experience of this emergency, where hospitals were being built, lives were being saved, our frontline workers were being clapped, and we were in the midst of how on earth do we respond to this crisis. And then over the last 6 to 9 months, we've been through this cycle of emergency response and then recovery, and then going back into response mode again as a second wave comes. And maybe we know that there will be a third wave even after Christmas, before we get into the vaccine and the hope that will bring to the whole of our society. And then thinking about how do we recover and how do we reconstruct after this. And I've been using all through that time this mechanism of response, recovery and reconstruction to help us think about how we frame our leadership in this moment in time. But there's no doubt in the midst of that actually, as we've gone through emergency response and as we've gone through recovery, that actually we've had to learn to lead in a different way. We've had to learn to lead in the midst of uncertainty. In many ways, it's exposed the myth that we were ever in control, and helped us to wrestle with these issues of how do we lead when we can't plan? How do we lead when we can't even plan beyond today or tomorrow, where the horizon of our leadership isn't 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year or 3 years or 5-year plans, but actually 5-minute plans, 5-day plans, if we've been lucky. So how do we lead within the midst of that great uncertainty? And how do we lead in the midst of heightened emotions as well? There is a reality that we've come close to death. We've come close to our own sense of mortality. And within that, our value systems have been thrown up in the air, and we don't yet know where they're going to land. And our emotions have been dragged left, right and centre. Who do we have in our family groups for Christmas being the latest one, as well as seeing people struggling with the issues of mental health and us struggling with our own mental health. And how do we find the emotional language to engage with people who've lost their job, who have, when we're facing large scale unemployment, who haven't been able to go into a church building for over 9 months and probably will be 12 months now, are having to face up to the needs to wear masks. And so we see this great level of uncertainty, and we also see a massive sense in which our emotions are heightened, and leaders saying to me, Simon, how do we lead during this time? How do we lead, and when's it going to end? There is a reality here that I think that whereas we're full of hope that a vaccine will come, actually that as leaders, the way that we navigate these next 12 months is going to continue to be challenging to us and uncertain to us. The reality of stepping back into a church building and leading again in April and May, when people are maybe able to gather once more, is going to be as challenging as responding in the first time, because everybody's expectations are up in the air, everybody's values are up in the air, everybody's sense of what's real and how do we rebuild. There are going to be many more different voices that are needed in this midst of uncertainty. I'm reminded of a situation that happened for me maybe 10 years ago. And as part of my role with Samaritan's Purse, I took about 10 to 12 chief execs, senior leaders from businesses into rural Mozambique. And as we travelled into Guija district and we camped under the stars in a local village, and we didn't know what we were going to have for food for the next day, all our decision-making ability was taken away from us. And actually, we were just pleased that there was food on the table, and we were just pleased to survive. And actually, the sense that we were in lockdown there made us quite pliable to what was happening, and the decisions were easier because we knew we were within a set of constraints. And then we took those business leaders back into the Holiday Inn in Maputo in Mozambique before they flew back to Heathrow as a kind of how do we help you re-enter back into your normal home life. And we came down for breakfast the following morning, and people started complaining because there was only orange juice, and there wasn't orange juice and apple juice and tomato juice and whatever other juices you normally have. And there is a sense that actually we are going to have to navigate a situation where people start to be released from lockdown, start to be released from the constraints, and actually start to map out a future for themselves, which is intensely uncertain, but also has many more opportunities. And I think what we're going to see is people really wrestling with that. What kind of future do we want to build? What kind of hope do we want to bring? What kind of community do we want to build as we come out of isolation? And as leaders, we're going to lead through that. And that's going to require two things of us. And we're going to explore these two things in the seminar together. So first of all, it's going to require us to navigate continuing uncertainty. None of us have been here before. None of us have rebuilt out of a moment of a global pandemic and a global emergency. None of us really know how to do this and to do it well. Yes, there's things we can learn from global emergencies. Yes, there are things we're going to learn from one another, and we need that community and that sense of working together. But how can we navigate that uncertainty? And so in the seminar, we'll be exploring this issue of polarities. Now, if you're like me, I'm 55, I'm a baby boomer. We were brought up to solve problems. In a certain world, we were brought up to understand all the data, to find out the issues, and to go and solve a problem and get a problem fixed. The reality in an uncertain environment is that we're often wrestling with tensions. I call them polarities. We're wrestling with polarities. We're wrestling with uncertainties and the need to grapple with those. Now, in the pandemic, we've seen a number of those that have just been heightened for us. We've seen our government wrestling with health or economy. Do we look after people's health and look after the vulnerable, or do we seek to maximise the benefit to the economy during this crisis? Which one is more important? How do we manage that tension, and how do we manage that uncertainty? As church leaders, you've wrestled with the online versus offline. How do we engage our congregations, many of whom haven't wanted to go back into the building, in an online world, as well as coping with those who actually really want to get back into, really want to understand what it means to rebuild in a physical sense? So how do we manage that tension of online and offline? And in the seminar, I'll take you through 12 polarities. And we'll look at those and think about what it means, and give you some tools to help you work through what it means to lead through a time of uncertainty, and how thinking about tensions and polarities can help us in navigating that continuing uncertain space which is going to exist for us. And then secondly, we're going to look at this whole issue of finding a new emotional language. The reality that actually during 2021 we're going to see an outpouring of mental health issues, things that we've pressed down, things that haven't been talked about because we haven't been in community, are going to rise to the fore. And as leaders, creating the environments in which people can look back and can process what's happened to them over the last year, can process the sense of anxiety, the grief that we've had, that can remember what we've been through before we accelerate into growth, that actually we can help people process and work through their own mental health and well-being. And so I think it's going to be really important for us as leaders to find a new emotional language. And empathy is going to be right at the heart of that. Empathy, the ability to see the world through other people's eyes. It's been well said during this crisis. Same storm, different boats. If you're a frontline health worker, you've experienced it differently to the way that I've experienced it as a home worker, working from my office, which is where I'm speaking to you from now. A really different sense of what this crisis is going to be, has been about, and different struggles. And our ability as leaders to really lead out of our own sense of identity and to see the world through other people's eyes and create an environment in which people are able to be really vulnerable and really honest and really share about what they've learned during this time is going to be so vital as we start to reimagine the future and reimagine what that can be like. First of all, we need to listen. We need to really, really listen to people. We need to hear the stories of what's happened. We need to hear the testimonies of what's happened. We need to create safe and supportive spaces where people can wrestle with their grief and with their emotions, where there can be a real sense of lament about what has happened and a real sense of engaging with one another and learning from what's happened before we start to rebuild. And so I would plead for us as leaders to create the space for that to happen, not to rush back into celebration, but to actually engage with a lament and an emotional outpouring that allows people to share what they've been through. Because I fear what will happen if we don't do that is that the emotions will get pushed down, that the feelings that we've had have been pushed down, and then actually we'll get a massive schism, a massive fracture happening between those who are resilient and bold and celebratory and have the gift of engaging and looking forward and being hopeful, actually creating a massive schism between that and our desire to get back in and to welcome and to embrace, and also our need to process and to process well. And so there are some great tools. Kintsugi Hope Wellbeing Groups is one that I'm involved in, that are just helping people to create those safe and supportive spaces to enable people to engage in their own emotions. And then lastly, so we'll look at uncertainty, we'll look at empathy and our emotions and engaging with those. And then finally, we'll look in this session about how we look forward and how we create a sense of vision and purpose in the midst of this uncertainty. How do we set the riverbanks within which our leadership is going to happen? I'm a great one for strategy. I love working with teams on 5-year strategies and directions for organizations is what I do for a living. But the reality is, in the midst of uncertainty, how can you set and give a sense of purpose and hope to your people? And how is that freeing and enabling in this environment? I learnt this through my experience in emergency relief and disaster response, where we would send people into situations like responding to Ebola in Liberia, or the civil war in South Sudan, between South Sudan and Sudan, or an earthquake in Nepal, or responding to the crisis in northern Iraq and what had happened in Mosul. And in those situations, we learned how important it was to be very clear about your purpose and vision, to set that as the direction for people in the midst of responding to uncertainty. And then how important it was to articulate your values and your ethos, and also your theory of change and your operating principles, and to create a set of riverbanks within which the organization and your church can actually flourish and grow during this time, and how helpful that is as leaders to be able to give that sense of purpose. So I'm looking forward to the seminar with you on Monday the 11th at 3:30, engaging with you in thinking through these issues. How do we lead in the middle of crisis? And I hope the tools of thinking about what phase we're in, response, recovery, or reconstruction, of thinking about how do we manage uncertainty and how can polarities and tensions help us to do that, thinking about our own sense of emotional well-being and how we create this new emotional language to engage with people in their emotions, and then thinking about how we set direction and purpose and riverbanks. Some really useful tools that we'll share with you. I really look forward to engaging with you in that session and hearing your views on these issues, as well as we all work together to see God's kingdom come in the United Kingdom in a fresh and a new way in the days ahead.